Welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk. With the ANZ Commodities Price Index showing a lift to be 50% higher than at the same time last year, doesn't this show yet again just how important agriculture is and will continue to be to the New Zealand economy? But Federated Farmers is quick to warn that urban dwellers thinking farmers get all the benefits need to think again. The extra price per kilogram they'll be charged in the supermarkets for staples such as cheese doesn't all end up in the producer's pocket, with their economics and commerce spokesman Phil York saying farmers are no ATM. So without all the policy and red tape, could agriculture contribute much more to the national economy? Today I'm joined by economic commentators Rod Oram and Brian Gaynor. Well, Brian, what sort of shape are the fundamentals of the economy in at the moment?
They're not too bad if we look at it on a short-term basis. We're certainly in a much better position than most European countries and Northern Hemisphere countries. And the reason for that is we're next door to Australia, which is doing phenomenally well. And we're also taking advantage of the boom in China. Exports to China are increasing dramatically. However, there's a sword hanging over the economy, and that's the huge level of personal debt. And that was the cause of most of the problems in the Northern Hemisphere. It hasn't become a major issue here, but potentially it will, unless we start repaying some of the debt that we have, because a lot of the personal debt has been borrowed offshore through our banking system, and means we as a country are highly indebted as well as individuals.
Right. So with the commodity price upswing at the moment, is that masking this more serious problem that's underlying the whole economy?
It very definitely is. You know, the growth in the soft commodity prices has been very beneficial to the economy. We have a trade surplus for the first time in a long time. It is masking it, and it is giving the impression that things are a bit better than they were. Now, don't get me wrong, things are quite good out there compared to the rest of the world, but debt is always a major problem eventually. You cannot continue to borrow and borrow without it finally coming home to roost. It may take a year, it may take 2 years, it may take 3 years, but it will turn out to be a problem at some stage in the future.
Yeah, so action is needed now, Rod.
Yes, indeed, and it's not just households as well, although, as Brian points out very rightly, our high household debt is important. We have the second most indebted households in the OECD, but there's also an awful lot of debt out in the primary sector as well. On-farm debt of dairy farms went from $10 billion to $43 billion in less than a decade, and essentially all that did was drive up the price of land. So farmers need to ask themselves some very hard questions about their debt loads as well.
Presumably with the lift in Fonterra's forecast payout, a lot of that money is going to go straight into debt repayment?
Hopefully. The best reason that it might is that the banks have become a lot more cautious about lending. But it's still up to the farmers to have the discipline not to go chasing after more land with debt-fueled acquisitions, which only then keep the price of land high. So at the end of the day, it's very much about the financial discipline that farmers impose on themselves, and thankfully the banks have tightened up that a bit as well.
Right. So, Brian, generally, how much are banks to blame in terms of the personal debt levels as well as specifically the rural debt side of things?
Well, banks are doing the business banks are allowed to do, and of course the banks were deregulated here back about 25 years ago when the new Labour government came in '84, and they are lending aggressively when they can borrow money, particularly from offshore. And we do have a problem though, because we're a commodity produced nation, we tend to get big escalation in prices. And when prices are good, farmers tend to want to borrow to buy new land, and if the banks have got lots of money to lend, they will lend that money. And therefore we do get positions like we are at the moment where farmers are too heavily indebted. Farmers have to refrain themselves and not get too much into debt. Obviously farmers who don't have much debt are going to do very well over the next year or so, but those who've got a high level of debt are still, even with the high prices, are going to find things quite difficult. So the warning really is, remember, banks are like an umbrella. They'll give you an umbrella when you don't need it, and they'll take it back when you actually need it. So be very careful when you're borrowing from banks, because they can become very tough when their credit dries up.
Right. So, Rod, should Federated Farmers be putting some of their efforts into putting this message out there to farmers rather than trying to set things right with urban dwellers in terms of farming's importance to the economy.
Absolutely, but it's only part of a much bigger picture which goes right to the heart of euphoria or not over the current booming commodity prices. One thing we do know about commodity price booms is that it encourages other producers, and so we will see a sharp ramp up in production in other parts of the world. On land much cheaper, and in many ways it'll be land just as good if not better than ours, versus the expensive land here. And so federated farmers should be looking in that global context about how to make New Zealand farming still profitable long term as that other production ramps up overseas. For example, we need to bear in mind that we think of ourselves as a large dairy producer, but in fact annual production in New Zealand is pretty much only the size, the same volume as the increase in production worldwide each year. So in that sense, we're a marginal player.
So what should the message be that that federated farmers are getting out there as regards agriculture?
Rather than being incredibly introspective and concentrating only on things like the costs of ACC and other regulatory issues, which are important, those need to be kept under control, but absolutely trying to understand what that global picture is and trying to understand how New Zealand farming can compete internationally. And on that, federated farmers has no insight, nothing sensible to say.
Do you agree with that, Brian?
We've always got to remember, one of the problems I always find about New Zealand is that when we get a land boom, people say, well, there's a limited supply of land. Well, actually, that's garbage, really, because there is a huge amount of land available around the world that can be used if commodity prices get higher, because that's the marginal land, and there's quite a substantial amount of it. I mean, if you look at the latest edition of National Geographic magazine, they're talking about global warming, and Greenland is now opening up. A lot of areas where they've never been able to grow food before, they're able to grow food because of the warming climate. So we tend to fool ourselves on the basis that land is limited, and therefore when we bid up the prices, that's a realistic economic decision. It's not, because land is not limited. And I think that's a message farmers and indeed any purchaser of properties need to realise when they're buying.
Right. So any picks as to how long the commodity upswing is likely to last this time around? A bit of a loaded question.
You know, for those of us who've been involved in looking at commodity prices for over 30 years, you never actually know. It's a bit like looking at the share market. At the moment, it does look quite good. The outlook for commodity prices looks good. I think Fonterra is doing a good job in terms of the way it's managing its business. But look, it could turn quite easily in 3 months, 6 months. It could go on for another year or 2 years. It's very difficult to predict commodity prices.
Rod, do you agree with Brian about Fonterra doing a good job at present?
Reasonably good job internationally. I think it's dead right that it wants to be the leading supplier of ingredients and commodities. And in order to do that, of course, it always needs to keep increasing its non-New Zealand supply in order to keep up with world demand. That's all absolutely dead right. But it begs the question entirely of what that leaves the farmers doing in New Zealand. And it can't be to produce largely undifferentiated commodities. And that's where Fonterra's strategy, indeed the whole dairy industry strategy, is just a huge gaping hole for which they have no answers.
So something needs to be done at the top level in terms of positioning local policy more closely with Fonterra's international policy, where they're just buying another cheese business over in the US. They've got all their ducks in a row at that level of things.
That's dead right. But let me just take it right back to the overall imperative for the economy. The Prime Minister wants us to catch up with Australia by 2025. To do that, we have to grow the economy at twice the rate we're doing now. To do that, we need to double, in real terms, the value of exports. So I go around the country saying to every sector, and for example, for the dairy industry, how would you double the value of your exports, taking out inflation, over the next 15 years? And pretty much the only answer is to double the volume of production. Well, where are we going to put double the number of cows we have now would be the first question I'd ask farmers.
Yeah, well, we just can't, can we?
No, absolutely not.
Oh.
So in other words, unless farming gets this right, it would not be playing its role in achieving that long-term goal for the New Zealand economy. And if the rest of the economy achieves that goal, then farming will become proportionately less valuable to the New Zealand economy. So that's the dilemma, that's the challenge that farmers need to bear in mind.
Is that a good or a bad thing, Brian, that farming became less valuable to the economy?
The best economy is a diversified economy. And if you look at New Zealand and say you compare it to Ireland, which was very similar 30 years ago, it was 90%